since these cubes don't really have much form to them, I'm just going to start going into them and subdividing them and doing a little bit of sculpting. I'm just going to try and come up with some unique forms, something that's not nice taper to them, and typically a handful of spires here and there sprinkled throughout the city adds for a nice vertical look. You'll notice that I've subdivided the boxes into just a little spire to the top of this one tower. Scale down the tip so that it tapers. Copy that and scale down the whole body so that it has two little steps in the spire. You'll notice that I like to group objects that are common. So, for example, this spire, since it was two different pieces, I put them in a group and name the group. And now later on, if I want to grab a spire, I can just go and look for that in the list and copy it. I'll do the same with the building. If the building has multiple parts, I'll group it into one, and then I'll just name that building. Later on, if I want to, I can grab that copy, move it around, open up the group, perhaps move around its parts, create a different looking building really quickly, and close the group. That way, each time you create a building, you're not necessarily starting from scratch. So I'm still just trying to fill up the terrain here with enough buildings that it mimics that background texture map. Have a little bridge between the two. A lot of buildings, especially if they're going to be futuristic or otherworldly, you're going to have to get in there and detail them a fair amount. And each one of those buildings is going to require a decent amount of your time. Therefore, if you're working with a team, you can create groups of buildings, and it basically creates a library. And if you create a library smart enough, you can then benefit without spending a whole lot of time. You can fill up very large scenes and repeat their usage over and over again. Because these buildings are going to be rendered out and put into you're going to create a bunch of buildings to be used in a library for a whole sequence of map paintings. You might attack this in a slightly different fashion. Number one, you might want to give yourself more time to model and detail these buildings along with their texture maps. And you'd probably want to set them up in such a way so that they rendered nicely with the general lighting scenario. And therefore, anytime another mad artist grabbed one of these buildings out of the library for use in their map painting, again working in a team scenario, then as the lighting changes throughout the sequence or throughout the feature film, then the buildings will still look acceptable. So as you can see, it can be quite time consuming to make large clusters of buildings. And for this reason, this is why I take this approach. Mimicking was painted and all those buildings were placed with consideration of their relationship to the rest of the map painting, with their composition and with regard to how much positive and negative space there is in the entire scene, especially related to the hero buildings in the foreground. So I think it would be a mistake to just come into 3D Studio Max and start placing these buildings back here randomly, because it is time consuming. What you're going to end up with is you can spend a lot of time creating clusters, and once they render, more often than not, you're not going to end up with a picturesque view, and it's not really going to supplement that map painting as good as it could have if it were otherwise planned. If you want to continue sculpting buildings with edit mesh on them, it creates a bunch of faces on the side connecting the new face to the old body. So every once in a while I use the extrude polygon tool just to create extra polygons where I need, and some extra form, typically here at the top of buildings. I'm just checking back in Photoshop quickly, and we'll go back to Max. And what I'll do is I'll select all these buildings, and I'll put a gray shader on them. Just something that blends into the map painting a little bit better. We don't want that blue anymore. And bring that rendering into Photoshop. At this point in time, I just want to bring them in at a scale that is going to line up close enough, but I want to feel free in Photoshop to scale things, squash and stretch them so that they look more picturesque. Again, we don't want to handcuff ourselves by working in 3D and feel that we're tied to that 3D world. Come in here and we have things lined up quite buildings. Each one of these lights is an instance of themselves, and that allows me to tie the color and the lighting intensity to one light, and that way when I make a change on one, all the rest change. So it's a bit too bright, so I'll knock it down a bit, 0.3. That looks better. So our gray buildings now are showing a cast of light that's kind of warm, kind of pink, similar to our plate. So I'm going to jump ahead here and show you several of these clusters rendered not only with gray, but with a really crude texture on them. A texture that just shows really loose scale, window scale. Might be able to use a combination of the gray and the textured layer to get us a little bit of detail in those buildings. Now, since it is such a hazy scene, we don't want to have too much detail reading on those far buildings. We just want to have a little hint of texture and scale. Now I'm just trying to find the right balance between texture and the flat gray layer. If you ever find that you've committed to a texture that's not quite bold enough because you've given it some transparency, you can always duplicate that layer. The more you duplicate it, the more opaque it becomes. So I'm just continuing to search for a good look here. We'll check the left-hand side out here. I think the leftmost buildings, this cluster, I'll remove the black mat. It's got a little bit of an edge on these buildings, but I think the buildings here on the left need to be hazed back, probably the most out of this entire city. So I'm just going to mat them out separately. So we have 3 groups now, 3 identical layers, but we can only see 1/3 of each of them. And I'm just going to duplicate this group so that I can feel free to play around with this one group called towers, the yellow group. And if I make any mistakes, I can just immediately discard it and jump back to my towers backup layer. This is another trick that I do quite often. Obviously you can save multiple Photoshop files in different iterations. But I just find that having that towers backup layer right below the place where I'm working is one of the quickest ways to revert back to something if you make a mistake or if you make any decisions that just don't look good. Even though I have multiple layers that are fairly editable, sometimes when you merge layers together and you proceed down the road several steps later, you realize that you might not want to have merged those layers together. So in that instance, or let's say you've softened something too much, just in general, if you've committed to something and you want to uncommit, you can back yourself up and go on to, in this case, the towers backup layer group, and discard anything that you didn't like. I'm just going to keep scaling these buildings until I feel they have a better proportion with respect to the foreground buildings. Darken them down a bit. I'm taking cues from that horizon just off to the left. The land that's nearby the buildings, just off to the left, is pretty dark. There's not a whole lot of light. Okay, so I copied a layer, this haze layer, and I'm just going to darken it with a soft brush, just so the bottoms of the buildings come down a little bit more. Again, I'm taking cues from the land just off to the left, nearby those buildings. It's part of the plate that really exists. It's a good idea to always analyze the plate when you're adding your elements to it, because there's these little regions you'll find throughout a plate that are fairly inconsistent with what you might feel would be reality. And it's amazing to see how lighting changes throughout one particular shot, just from the left to the center to the right side of the shot, and also in regards to its depth. So just crop the top of this thing off, chop it off, and in return it also becomes a little sharper because it was painted so soft earlier on. I'm just trying to make these forms look a little more complicated, add some definition of, as opposed to just being big large blocks in the background. We want to have a little bit of stair stepping and just some idea that there's a real So these buildings in the center of the frame need a bit of attention. Maybe a little bit of haze. I just took a copy of the plate like I've done numerous times and pasted it over top of the these buildings. And I'm just going to play with its values. A little bit of airbrushing, lighten the tops of these buildings. A little bit. I'm also taking cues from the sky. Again, the sky looks pretty dark near the horizon, and it gets brighter as we go up to the top of the frame. So I'm kind of mimicking that in a smaller scale on these buildings. We'll keep the bottom of the building slightly dark, and then as we go up, a little bit more light is reflecting, a little bit more light is hitting the buildings. Just curve it a little bit, see how it looks. Undo it, redo it. That's the beauty of having a single step of undo in Photoshop, is you can make a change and then sit back and just toggle it on and off, undo and redo with one key, and just take a look and note the changes, whether they're improvements or not. So these couple buildings need to darken them down, make them stand forward a little bit from the rest in their cluster. Plus it helps to tie them into the extreme foreground buildings a little bit better. It looks like there's a little bit of a dark edge on that one building. The side of it darkened down more than I wanted, so I'm just going to flash that up a little. One thing to pay attention to when you're working with a lot of atmosphere is your black levels. You want to make sure that you don't have items that are too heavily darkened or too black as you recede back into space. So now this area here in the center looks like if we add a little more shadow to it, it might feel like those buildings are truly behind the other taller buildings. I think that looks better. I'm just hopping around the painting right now. I'm just in search of anything I can tweak and try and bring the painting up to the next level. Trying to consider all of the color and brightness, contrast, haze levels, scale, perspective issues at this point in time. So regarding composition, we don't want to have too empty of a space back behind this little group of buildings. So we have some distant buildings, we'll haze them back. They're quite small because they're far away. And now we don't have an opening that seemed a little phony. It seemed like we were really looking through to a city that wasn't really developed back there. Cleaned up that edge on that one building. We have reached that point in time where we should start paying attention to the edges of things in the painting, because the painting is nearing a point of completion. We don't want to leave all the edge work till the end. As you scan around the image and you pick up these little flaws that are wrong, at this point in time it's pretty safe to go in and start cleaning things up, because we do know what's working in the 3D part of things, in the camera map scene. So as we get in here, if something looks flawed in Photoshop, then we know it's going to look flawed in 3D Studio Max as well. So I just want to get rid of this edge here. Too saturated, too magenta. This building here, however, its perspective is way off, so why don't we attend to this? Though the building is kind of hidden in this part of the city with a lot of light, a lot of orange light, yellow light, its scale is quite far off. We have this giant building behind these foreground buildings on the waterfront, and I think in real life it probably is quite a large building. However, it just seemed a little too massive. So I'm just gonna, what I've done is I just went and copied it onto another layer so I can edit it, and so now I can scale it down and not affect the bigger buildings behind it. Although you can see a repeat of itself where it used to be. And I'm just gonna make a duplicate, and I'm gonna make it a longer building. Though making it longer does make it bigger. That's okay. My problem with having it appear so large initially was the scale of the windows, and the scale overall felt inappropriate. We can have a large building as long as it feels like it's the proper scale. So this building is just simply longer in design, and I'm just going to paint what should be behind it, which is just a few rows of windows. And just paint out some of the little unwanted artifacts. So now I'm just going to go and take a look at the right side here. See if we can get this to work a little bit better. I'm still not too happy with the way it looks. If we flash part of it, that might help it to blend into the background a little bit more. Just part of it. Plus it's getting a little more light, so I think that might do it. I'll treat these edges of these foreground buildings, since the buildings behind them are quite a bit lighter now. I have to make sure these edges look good. Again, it's kind of a contrast the area back there. Not super high contrast, but it's enough to pull out, to make obvious any of our flaws. Play around with the heights of these towers back in here. This is one of the benefits to working in 2D. We can change the scale of these things and immediately see how they relate to the rest of the composition. That's really one of the true benefits to doing a matte painting. If you want to make these adjustments in with your 3D model, you wouldn't be able to see how the adjustments are reflected in regard to your lighting and atmosphere immediately, like we do here in Photoshop. So I'm just going to make some final tweaks on this building top here. A little more haze on the top, and maybe just lighten these dark strips up a little bit. And I think we're about ready to close out this chapter.